How can there be Catholic nationalism? Because Catholic means universal. I mean, Catholic means that the universal is what we put first. But what is the truth about it? And some of the truth behind it is that nation, the community you live in, is important.
Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. Is it easier to make laws that enforce Christian values than it is to teach people to live Christian values freely? Is Catholic nationalism an oxymoron, or does it contain an important truth? We discuss these and other questions with our guests for this episode, Professor Colt Anderson from Fordham University. Professor Anderson specialises in Catholic forms of nationalism in America, but his insights go beyond that group and are relevant for any kind of Christian living anywhere. I hope you enjoy listening. Well, welcome, Professor C. Colt Anderson. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
And where are you talking to us from right now?
I am talking to you from the Bronx in New York.
Wow, exciting. Well, I am near a sunny lake in Switzerland. And where are you, Austin?
I'm down here in sunny South Florida.
Awesome. So we're talking from very, very different places, but we're going to be talking about a common theme, Christian nationalism. And I think, Professor Anderson, your expertise is more specifically in Catholic forms of nationalism. So we'll focus on that specifically in a second. But just to make sure we're all on the same page about the definitions that we're using, when we're talking about nationalism, what's your understanding of what we're talking about?
We know there are, of course, a lot of different definitions of nationalism. There's some that are kind of value neutral. So that would be, let's say, a value neutral definition might be the attitude that members of a nation have when they care about their national identity, right? So, I
It's
just
quite a
sort of
soft
looked
definition.
right, very soft definition. More typically, nationalism is defined as the premise that an individual's loyalty is primarily to the state, their state, their nation, and that's the primary focus of loyalty.
That's a bit of a stronger definition, really, because you might run into conflicts there with people who think that their loyalty should primarily be to their religion or their faith.
Right, right. And I think that, actually, I prefer the stronger definition. I don't really start with my work so much from a kind of abstract or definitional standpoint, as there are certain behaviors that concern me, and there are certain attitudes that concern me, and that's more my focus. But I see nationalism as essentially making the claim that, a person's loyalty and first loyalty is to the nation, which is primarily but not always understood as a sovereign state. I mean, there are nationalist liberation movements. That's a way of organizing people for a political agenda. And that's another way of thinking about the term of nationalism. But in general, when I'm thinking about nationalism, I'm really thinking about an ideology that prioritizes the state.
Right, an ideology that prioritizes the state.
I mean, it could be on ethnic grounds, right? It could be on cultural grounds. It could be on political, ideological grounds. Those would all be different forms.
So you said when you sort of start your thinking about this, you tend to start from the behaviors that concern you rather than from abstract definitions. So what are these behaviors that you're seeing in the world that are concerning you right now that would go under this name?
Well, I would say there are basically 5, maybe 6 behaviors. And the first is a rejection of the rules of the game. A rejection of democratic institutions that protect people's civil rights. State must ensure the equality of citizens before the law, and these groups are trying to use religion in part as a means to discriminate against different groups. So that's my first concern. Groups that deny the legitimacy of political opponents, particularly when they demonize them. And I mean that in really quite literal terms, if you look at the U.S. situation, there are plenty of Christian nationalists that were running around talking about Biden being, demonically possessed and having prayer services to cast demons out of like Washington, D.C. and so forth. But they also
Yeah, it's hard to
raise
get more
issues.
literal in demonization than that.
Right, right. I mean, I'm using the word. I mean, normally I would use that word in a way that was more like, oh, we're talking about impurity or other issues, which they raise those issues too. But so I see that as a problem, a behavior that I would put under the banner of Christian nationalism. Um, they deny the legitimacy of their political opponents. They tolerate or encourage violence. That really concerns me. They're ready to curtail civil liberties of their opponents. And then, they're willing to promote this is David's, big thing. They're willing to promote the big lie. And that big lie is one thing in the US, a big lie is something else in other countries, right? But
What's the
there's a
what's the
kind of,
big lie for the uninitiated?
I would really see it more as a general kind of disinformation campaign, right?
Right.
David really wants to focus on something like, in particular, like the 2020 elections and the denial that they were lost and the repeated like claims that that election was stolen is a sort of way of eroding people's commitment to truth.
Right. And the David we're talking about, by the way, is David Elcott, a Jewish scholar based in New York, who both Professor Anderson and I are familiar with.
Yes, and I worked on a book responding to religious nationalism, with David. So
That's right, and that's the book that we're going to be drawing on in this conversation. It's called Faith, Nationalism, and the Future of Liberal Democracy. And there's a chapter in it by you, which is called A Catholic Response to the Errors of Catholic Nationalism. So your focus is Catholic nationalism. What sort of form does Catholic nationalism take, as distinct from any other kind of nationalism?
all Christians have this kind of commitment to history that can lend itself to problems, right? Problematic interpretations, really, when it comes to nationalism. So for Catholics, we have such an emphasis on tradition that it enhances or it blurs the line between what might be considered religious tradition and what's just the things that happened in history. So to give you an example, there are any number of awful, horrible papal statements supporting the slavery of people, supporting
Or
colonialism
anti-Semitism?
or anti-Semitism, or, really just any number of different ways of being aggressively opposed to anybody who disagrees with them. So if you confuse tradition and history, you have an abundance of material that you can draw upon really to justify almost any political agenda. And I think that's pretty dangerous. And I don't think our bishops have done a very good job of pushing back against it. I think most of them know better.
Yeah, because essentially, you could justify anything that's not by just saying, well, this isn't totally new because it's happened in the past,
Right.
and then just saying, and that's part of our tradition. And it is, I think it's interesting, particularly within Catholicism, but in any, say, Christian tradition, right? That question of like, what of our past is our tradition, is a really kind of fraught and fascinating conversation. And then that the nuance goes away pretty quickly when it gets used in political debates.
If you look at the Christian nationalist movement, because there are Christian nationalists movements, right? I mean, there's not one movement in the U.S., right? But most of them, a lot of them, have very much a focus on American history, which they have fused through this idea of being the city on the hill and other things out of our history, with a kind of providential understanding of God that they can then use to justify all kinds of things that used to be that weren't good.
Yeah, so not just the history of kind of Christianity, but also the history of these different nation states. And I always find that, so fascinating, this idea that just because this was something that we did in the past, or even that people cared about in our past, that makes it acceptable or good, is obviously crazy, but has a lot of purchase in certain conversations.
Right.
So there's a thing you say right at the beginning of your chapter, which we could dig into a little bit. You said, this is on page 90, it is a Catholic axiom that in order to lead someone away from error, you must recognize the truth that gives power to the error. So I really like that principle that there's always truth in every lie, which is what makes the lie somewhat compelling and believable. Otherwise, it wouldn't be compelling and believable. But then, if that's the case, what would you say is the truth that gives power to Catholic nationalism?
Well, I think that there are some things that have happened that are true, right? They just on one level we can talk about truth as kind of intellectual ideas, but truth is also a subjective lived reality.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of people that I think our society has left out and has left behind. And there have been tremendous cultural changes in the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that there are people who are really unnerved and shaken by it. And I think that that's kind of the truth that sits at the heart of this kind of backlash and this kind of Catholic nationalism. But it's not a truth of faith. It's a truth of their lived experience, and it's a truth that maybe they haven't really been heard very well. It's very much true, I think, that we have not served people well in the Christian churches in
Not
general.
listen to people very well.
Right, right. And that is part of what we need to do. And there is this sense of superiority in most of the churches. And it's related to some of the other kind of work I do, which is on clericalism, but this kind of sense of assumed superiority that allows the clergy and a lot of the churches to simply dismiss the real lived concerns expressed by their people. And I think when that happens, people look for alternatives. And I think that that is part of the dynamic that has fed into the growth of Catholic nationalism, which is frankly an oxymoronic concept, right? I mean, when David first asked me if I would work on this issue of Catholic nationalism, I was like, what Catholic nationalism? I was like, how can there be Catholic nationalism? Because Catholic means universal. I mean, Catholic means that we are, the universal is what we put first. And, but David was right. And in fact, there was a lot of Catholic nationalism that I discovered. And then the more I thought about it, the more I realized, well, yeah, there's the Coughlin priest in the U.S., the anti-Semite. I mean, there's Pat Buchanan, definitely a nationalist running back in the 80s and 90s. And so I thought about it and I realized, no, in fact, there are a lot of Catholic nationalists. But what is the truth about it? And some of the truth behind it is that nation, the community you live in is important. And, their
The
unity.
local has certain importance. I mean, I think you find that in Catholic social teaching as well, right? This principle of subsidiarity, that you
Right.
shouldn't absorb the local into the universal at the expense of the distinctiveness of the local.
Though the
Right.
problem with nationalism, or one of the problems, as we've seen in earlier episodes, is that it precisely does that. It absorbs the local into a universal state. And it does seem, especially with these Christian nationalists, that they're not particularly interested in specific local communities, but an imagined national kind of culture and power structure that in many ways papers over the local.
A lot of them are very apocalyptic in their outlook. And that's actually how I started my career. My early research was on like apocalyptic movements in the Middle Ages. So,
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, I see there is a through line, right? Because these people have an apocalyptic ideology, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them. The Catholic nationalists, not so much so, but a lot of the Christian nationalists, at least in the US, have this apocalyptic movement. And their goal ultimately is to usher in the apocalypse.
The end of all time when Jesus returns.
Right. So they're scary to me. So that's what I mean. It's that's where my concerns come from. I mean, I don't start with, like one of the questions you sent me. I spent a whole week just thinking about this. Can nationalism be good? And I kept thinking about it and thinking about it. And, I'm looking at different definitions of nationalism. Like some people say you can talk about liberal nationalism, right? And when we wrote the
Interesting.
book, the decision was that we were going to criticize illiberal nationalism, illiberal religious nationalism. And I defer. I'm not a political scientist, and the book was in political science, and so I deferred to David Elcott on that. But I've been thinking about it, and I just don't think that nationalism is ever good. And it may have a kind of utilitarian or a kind of transitory. And there may be periods when, like a liberation movement of people needs to manifest, and maybe nationalism is a useful sort of approach for a moment. But if it settles in, I think it's always going to end up being a problem.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the take that we found in William Cavanaugh. I don't know if you know the theologian William Cavanaugh at DePaul University. He basically said he doesn't have much sympathy for Christian nationalism generally. He sees nationalism as a rival religion to Christianity. But you can be most sympathetic in the case of something like Ukrainian nationalism, where the
Right.
Ukrainians are actually fighting for their identity against this massive force that's literally trying to conquer and obliterate them. But perhaps what you're saying, what I'm hearing you say, is that same Ukrainian nationalism that you can sympathize with right now would not lead to a good place if the Ukrainians were successful and re-established themselves as a nation, because then it would lead to its own sort of violence and abuses.
Right. Over time, it would harden into something that would be destructive. Right. So, I mean, I think it was Orwell who made this distinction between nationalism and patriotism. That nationalism is when you love your country and territory so much, but you want to impose that lifestyle on others. Right. Whereas, like patriotism, you love your country, but it's more defensive. It's more that you're willing to let others live how they want to live, but you will defend your own way of life. I don't know if that's really totally true. I'm sure political scientists could shred me on that point, right?
Well, I guess the trouble
But
is that a lot of these nationalists feel like they're defending the way of life that they love from threat of being completely undermined by various liberal political agendas, right? That's the sense I get from them.
yeah, and the problem though is that what they have, what they construct, is not religion. I would agree with Kavanaugh. It's a rival to religion because what they are doing is they take the symbols of religion and they take the symbols and mythology of a national origin and they fuse them together to create a kind of civil religion. And then that becomes a kind of litmus test, right? So, like when I used to teach a seminary for years and years, and I was a dean of a Catholic seminary. And the seminarians would say, "Well,
Oh,
Dr.
wow.
Anderson, how can you, how can you be a Democrat?" Because I would let them know I was. Um, and I said, well, I have a lot of reasons that I can be a Democrat. I mean, the whole social teaching of the church, I see the no allegiance to that within the Republican Party, and they're like, how can you support Democrats when they support abortion? I said, well, Democrats aren't making people get abortions. I see there's a difference between taking away someone's health care and allowing someone to do something that I think is immoral. I mean, those are different kinds of things, right? So, but I used to say, you can't conflate your religion and your faith. Being a Republican is not a litmus test for being Catholic, right? If you want to be a Catholic priest, you need to be thinking the Catholic faith is the primary thing, and then that should be used to understand how you evaluate different political positions, right? And what you have as primary is backwards, is what I would tell
That should be true for any kind of Christianity, right?
them. Right.
Christianity is the standard by which you measure political parties. Although I think most of the supporters of the Republican Party would say that that's what they're doing, right?
I'm sure they would say that. I mean, I'm a theologian, like I mean, I read St. Paul in Greek. I mean, the things that they say, I don't see how they correlate with the actual New Testament, right? That's actually part of my problem too. In my mind, that's part of the big lie, right? That what they're saying in any sort of way. I mean, the whole point of like much of like the Old Testament is accepting migrants, right? And refugees, right? And the whole story about Jesus actually being a refugee, like, they were a refugee family. And, yeah, you can have all kinds of policy distinctions between, how many refugees do you think we can support and this and that and the other. But there is no way that you can justify cruelty to refugees, whether they're fleeing just crushing poverty or gangs or political repression. Even if you can't accept them, there is no way that you can square that with the revelation of God, just to put it in those terms. And, and that's my problem. That's my problem with these people, right? Because there's that famous line, and it was famous in the Middle Ages, right? Because they love to quote it, about all kinds of people. It's like the attack line, right? But in these last days, there are going to come people, these lovers of pleasure, who mislead people with the faith, right? All these like warnings. There's the warning in Jude. There's the warning First, Second John, and I can't remember whether it's First or Second Timothy. The precursors to the Antichrist, the false prophets. I generally don't use that kind of language in discourse, right? Because it's not demon, it's kind of demonization in a way. But you can't say that you're being Christian and then promote the things that they promote. I mean, it just doesn't add up. And so that's a huge problem for me as a theologian. And I cannot sit back and just allow that to happen. That's how I got engaged in this in the first place, because I was working in response to the Christian Coalition, way back in the 90s.
Oh, you might need to introduce, for those of us who are a bit younger, what's the Christian Coalition?
The Christian Coalition was founded by like Paul Weyrich, who was one of the big leaders of, the Christian right in the US, and Joseph Coors and Jerry Falwell. And what they wanted to do was use their connections and their, the list that they have to send out a message that was primarily a tax message, to tell you the truth. I mean, that was primarily what it was about. But they would frame it in Christian categories, so like PBS is training your kids to be devil worshippers on Sesame Street would be like the sort of like stuff they would spew out into like the parishes, the Baptist churches and evangelical churches all throughout the South, which is where I'm from. And so, but they were totally motivated by a kind of tax agenda, really, back then, it seemed like. I mean, I can't read their hearts. Um, but that was really what, and I felt like, it was really manipulative and dishonest and disingenuous. And so I became engaged with a group called the Interfaith Alliance,
The
which
Interfaith
was
Alliance.
pushing back against this kind of use of religion in a manipulative way, to try to persuade people about these various policies. And so I did that, and then after that I worked. I know that this is nonpartisan, but I mean, I was an advisor to the Democratic Party, and I trained people how to respond to the rhetoric of the religious right. I gave an address called "Defanging the Rhetoric of the Religious Right." And it wasn't that I hate Republicans, right? That's never been my issue. My issue has been these people who use religion to manipulate people in ways that strike me as, frankly, just kind of blasphemous. I mean, that's what, I'm engaged in this fight because I believe that, we need to push back against these kinds of things. And I believe it's terribly destructive to the Christian church, Catholic Church, the Christian Church, all of us, if we are like wrapped up in this Christian nationalism stuff, because it really undermines our credibility. I mean, if somebody has ever read the Bible and then they look at what these people say, that the cognitive dissonance becomes quite great.
Yeah, it's really, I think one of the things that's come up in a few of our conversations, and now you've raised sort of two sides of this, is that it seems to me one of the biggest things that these kind of versions of Christian nationalism are doing is, in part, they're trying to say Christianity should be this thing that they've kind of created, but also that nationalism should be this thing, right? And it's not so much that they want the right to sort of be either of those things, but that they want to impose both of those across the board, right? And so again, if patriotism was kind of all of us in our differences and diversity love our state for the way that it sort of enables our local communities to exist, nationalism is increasingly, we want to get rid of any of your local communities if they don't, look like what we want our nation to look like. And same with Christianity, right? Christianity needs to look like this. We're going to use these kind of political shibboleths to try to push out anybody who doesn't, toe that political line. And then you're sort of like, what is this really either Christianity or nationalism? It's, this kind of new thing.
Well, one of the things that I noted when you sent me information about the show is that you're ecumenical, right? But there's nothing less ecumenical than Christian nationalism, right?
Because it imposes one particular kind of Christianity on everybody and calls it the only true Christianity.
Exactly. They may be willing to cooperate right now. Like the seven mountain people and the Catholic nationalists, because they're concerned about LGBTQ people, right? Like that's one of the things. In particular with Catholic nationalism, that's a particular focus there. And so they make an alliance over these things, but they're not going to be able to coexist because, an evangelical sort of inspired seven mountain kind of theology is never going to fit with people who are primarily motivated by like a Catholic sense of the unitary executive. And so, allowing this.
So further down the line, they're going to fall out. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, which, I think it is. It's, in some ways so surprising to me to see Catholics on board with some of these. Because, you're talking like Pentecostal prosperity movement people, and you're sort of like, how are Catholics even in the same room with these people?
Right. And,
well,
a lot
I guess
of it
they
goes
feel
back
like
to
there's
abortion.
some common concerns. That there's some certain priorities that you can work together with them on right now.
Yeah, the other thing people a lot of times may not realize if they're not living in the Catholic world is that, Catholics are deeply, deeply anti-communist, right? Like I was raised, and I remember like Sister Mary Margaret telling me that if the Russians came and they were to like invade Savannah, Georgia, where I lived, and come in the cathedral and take I should grab the Bible and the host, and I should be willing to give up my life to protect it against those godless communists, right? So a lot of people don't realize there's this and there's a kind of patriotism that Catholics in the U.S. have had because we were always seen as the outsiders, right? And there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment in the U.S. And so Catholics doubled down on U.S.
Trying to prove themselves as true Americans.
Right.
Faithful American citizens. Because people were suspicious that they weren't, because their loyalty was really to the Pope, ultimately.
Exactly. And so there are those forces in the Catholic community in the U.S. that easily feed into the kind of nationalism that we're seeing. I don't think that can hold because the underlying thoughts and ideas are too disparate. But for the time being, they're using each other, these groups. But, I grew up in South Georgia. I lived in Savannah, which was great, but I also live in Statesboro, Georgia, which, there's a song called the Statesboro Blues. Anyway, Statesboro was like Klan land. And Statesboro was a dry county because it was run by the Baptists, Southern Baptists. And so you couldn't buy alcohol in Statesboro, and you could buy beer, but you couldn't buy beer on Sunday, right? And then there were all kinds of other laws that were basically religious blue laws, and we all live with them. And you couldn't be elected if you were Catholic in Statesboro, Georgia, for anything, right? So I that's the environment I grew up in. I've never trusted these Christian right-wing nationalist kind of people, especially when they're trying to recruit Catholics to their side, because I know that if they were ever to achieve any kind of power, they would simply establish their vision of what Christianity is, and they would not recognize divergent approaches to the faith. And that would be terrible. I mean, I'm a church historian mainly, and so, I study like medieval and Reformation church history. I mean, you look at the wars of religion following the Protestant Reformation, you look at what happens if you try to structure like your political system on a religious kind of belief, the kind of conflicts that generates. I don't know why anybody would want to think that this is a good idea.
Yeah, I think it is a really significant, and this is, one of the really challenging things that I find in these conversations is with, which I wonder how different it is for you in Catholic contexts, because I think in conversations, say in more evangelical contexts, there is nothing to refer to decide what is really Christian and what isn't, right? And this is why these things move so quickly and easily, is because anyone with, who's charismatic or has a microphone can define for a whole massive number of evangelicals what Christianity actually is. And
you can just take it in a whole new direction very rapidly.
Yeah, and there's, as long as they convince them this is what the Bible says, then it's, it's really easy. But I think it's interesting in say the Catholic tradition, where you have a lot more to refer to say, hey, this isn't genuine Christianity. Do you find those conversations go very differently, or is it just that we're at a cultural moment where all those conversations are not happening, not working?
They don't work. They don't work with the people who are already in the Christian nationalist camp. They can work with the people that those people are influencing. Right, that's really what my goal has been, is and why I worked on this book is, because we were aiming at how to have strategies for churches to push back on this, right? And that can't be done ecumenically. It has to be done church by church, because the principles that each church accepts as having normative influence are different, right? So like in the book, I include all kinds of stuff from Vatican II that says, that you have to preserve people's dignity, and that you have to recognize people of different religious faiths and different genders and all of these other sort of matters. They didn't have the gender issue that we have, but different sex, different national background. So they laid out all of these principles that everyone should have the same civil rights under the law. I mean, it's all very clear. And yet we have U.S. bishops now who are aligning themselves with, these nationalists, and over gender issues, over the LGBTQ plus issues, really, in ways that, are empowering the same people who are attacking Catholic immigrants. Right. And they don't understand that they're feeding into the rhetoric of the same people who are attacking us over here. It's really insane and self-destructive.
Well, I guess what they would say they were doing is they're being faithful to Catholic teaching on those issues of sexual ethics, right? And they're finding allies where they can to support what is ultimately an attempt to align politics with Catholic teaching on LGBTQ stuff. Now, I know you've talked a little bit about this in your book, like you say, like on page 95, a Catholic could support civil protections for LGBTQ people and still oppose homosexual marriage. Or a Catholic could be concerned about how many refugees a country admits while promoting policies to provide aid to those refugees. So you're making a distinction there that I think is really interesting, that you can believe, say, or let's switch the example. You can believe that abortion is actually the taking of a human life, and yet still want or be opposed to policies that enforce that on other people. Is that the right way of putting it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. You can see abortion as immoral. I mean, there are a lot of things that are immoral that aren't illegal, right? And I see abortion as immoral, but politically, I'm not pro-life. To use that kind of language in the U.S. So, I believe that the way that this should work is that the bishops and the priests and the clergy, if they're trying to teach people about morality, should teach people about morality, and then they won't get abortions. That they have failed to persuade, and that's their role. Their role
So they
is
want
to
to use the force
persuade
of
people.
law instead. I guess that's
Right,
the point.
right. And where I see Christian nationalism rising and Catholic nationalism rising is in places where secularism is becoming more and more important force in society. Because it's easier, I think, to promote Catholic identity or Christian identity than it is to promote Catholic faith or the Christian faith. Right? You
Well,
can
it's
get
easier to
people.
vote in somebody who makes laws to support certain policies than it is to win people over to actually believe that a certain way of living is the right way of living.
Right, right. And I think that's a huge failure, really. Augustine said that not only does a preacher have to preach, but he has to preach in a way so that he doesn't make the truth abhorrent or too repelling, to accept, right? So I feel like what is happening is a lot of cases clergy are lining up with these nationalist groups because it provides them an easy way, to say that look, I'm promoting Catholic identity. But they're not, these people who are in these nationalist groups, they're not reading the Bible. They don't know, in our case, like Catholic social teaching. That's not what they're looking at or reading. They don't understand the faith really at all. They're just identifying. Maybe their grandparents were Catholic. Maybe they were baptized. These people don't go to mass. It's like the big image in my mind of the Christian nationalist will always be Trump standing outside of that church in D.C. with the Bible upside down. Like he's got the Bible, right? But it's clear he isn't reading it because he's holding it upside down, right? And so that's what
Yeah.
a lot of what's happening with Catholic nationalism is that, and people see like their way of life, the kind of patriarchal family way of life, the more conservative Catholics, they don't want that to erode. And
Yeah.
so it's quite compelling for them.
The subtitle for this podcast is Confronting Challenges to the Christian Faith with Hope. And so I'd like to sort of ask you a final question. Where do you see hope? Where do you see signs of positive change in regard to all of these issues that you've raised?
Well, I have to say, for the last year or two, it's really made hope a difficult sort of thing. Because I mean, I've just seen such. I mean, what's happening, I think, in my country is so terrible, and disheartening. But I guess what makes me hopeful is that like this kind of evil that's manifested in nationalism always overreaches. That it contains the seeds of its destruction within itself. I just worry about all the damage that will be done before that happens, I guess. I mean, so I see hope. I mean, this is not this too shall pass. But I
It's
guess
not
mainly I
forever.
just just see urgency that we have to respond, and we have to respond more and more, and this will pass, and we just have to try to be vigilant, right? I think that's what the gospel tells us is that there always be those who come to pervert the gospel of Christ, using kind of evangelical language, but I like evangelical language, right? They come to pervert the gospel of Christ for their own gain. And I see a bunch of them right now, and they seem to have the upper hand. And at some point, I think people will wake up. I think it's our job to try to facilitate that. And, I guess ultimately I believe that God is sovereign. And I just, hope he kind of maybe picks up the pace a little bit.
That's a reasonable hope.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's been a really fascinating and fun conversation, Professor Anderson. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.